Chapter 5. The Body in the Basement. By the early 1630s, Virginia had grown into an established, profitable colony. To the northeast, several English towns had taken root in Massachusetts. In 1634, another group of eager would-be settlers arrived in the Chesapeake region from England. This founded a new colony, Maryland. Like Jamestown's earliest settlers, the English who came to Maryland hoped to find a wealthier life in North America, but they weren't looking for gold or silver. They planned to make money by growing and selling tobacco. This crop had become wildly popular in England, where it was used for smoking and as medicine. Although tobacco couldn't grow in the cool, wet climate of England, the Chesapeake's warmer, longer-growing season was perfect for it. While the residents of Jamestown had never found the treasures they'd hoped to claim in Virginia, they did learn how to grow a type of tobacco that English buyers loved. By the time Maryland was settled in the 1630s, the plant had become almost as valuable as gold. As archaeologist Al Luckenbach explained, everybody in the Chesapeake grew tobacco. That was the way you tried to get rich. In fact, as the colonist plantations and their profits grew, Chesapeake settlers paid for most goods and services with tobacco instead of exchanging coins or paper money. Given the many tobacco plantations that existed in the Maryland colony, it came as little surprise to Luckenbach that one of the most fascinating excavations of his career took place on a site that had once been a tobacco plantation. Like many extraordinary scientific discoveries, however, it began like any other research endeavor. As the director of the Lost Towns Project, Luckenbach and his team learned about colonial living by finding and excavating long-forgotten sites in Maryland's Anne Arundel County. It was there, in 2003, that the team excavated the former home of planter named William Neal. In colonial times, the community established in that area was called Providence. The tract of land on which Neal's plantation was located was known as Levy Neck. For that reason, Luckenbach calls the site Levy Neck. According to land records of this period, Neal's plantation was about 120 acres, 49 hectares, the size of almost 110 football fields. By the standard of Chesapeake farmers, it was small and not particularly prosperous. At the time, Neal would have been referring to it as a middling planter, Luckenbach said. Land ownership records indicate that Neal acquired the Levy Neck property in 1662. Artifacts found during the excavation of the site support the team's belief that the house was built at that time. Further archaeological evidence supports the theory that the house was abandoned sometime around 1677, most likely after Neal's death, which occurred that year. That meant Luckenbach's excavation of the house would reveal activity that occurred within the time period of 1662 to 1677. The frame of Neal's house was fastened to posts that were sunk deeply into the soil. Like Jamestown's palisade walls, the soil stains left by the posts were the only remaining evidence of the structure. An earthen-walled cellar was located under the floorboards of the house, probably in front of the fireplace. Colonial cellars like this one were used for the storage of food, beverages in jugs, and household items. Archaeological evidence showed that Neal's cellar had also been used for another purpose, as a trash dump. People lived upstairs and dumped fish parts and pig parts and chamber pot contents and goodness knows what else down there, explained Luckenbach. The artifacts found among the levels of trash included a coin dated 1664. Just beneath the trash, and covered by only a thin layer of clay, lay something much more unusual, however, a human body. Unlike the captain's grave in Jamestown, where a trash pit had been located on top of a long-forgotten grave, the grave in Neal's cellar was located in a building that was occupied at the time the body was buried, and at the time of the burial, the cellar floor was already littered with trash. In the years following the burial, layers of trash completely filled the cellar. The most recent artifacts in these layers date to the late 1670s. That means the burial took place before then. The grave showed no signs of having been created with respect for the remains it contained. The shaft was poorly dug, with an uneven bottom. It wasn't even long enough. Whoever buried this person had to bend the legs to make the body fit. A large piece of broken ceramic, known to archaeologists as a sherd, lay on top of the skeleton's chest. Luckenbach recognized the sherd as part of a milk pan, a wide, shallow ceramic vessel that colonists used to hold fresh milk while cream rose to the surface. It looked very much like the milk pan was used to shove the body into the grave, Luckenbach noted. The archaeologist found several other pieces of milk pan among the trash nearby. It certainly appeared that the person who buried the body simply grabbed the nearest large object at hand to avoid touching the body. Further evidence of disrespect was even more illuminating. The body was lying on top of a broken pipe bowl, with no sign of deliberate, respectful grave goods, objects, or clothing buried with the body, Luckenbach said. Several of the bones had green stains, but they were too long and wide to be the remnants of shroud pins. The team believes that the stains are remnants of an unknown metal artifact that someone had tossed into the shaft as the grave was filled. The presence and location of a bone from a cow or an ox, a nail, and 2 oyster shells confirm that the cellar was definitely used as a trash pit at the time the body was placed in the grave. A cellar dumping ground is definitely not the type of place where English colonists would have buried someone that they loved or esteemed. Luckenbach suspected that the body in Neal's cellar might have been that of a person whose loved ones, if any, were far away in England. This person must have also lacked the friends, money, or status in the Providence community to ensure a proper burial. But why would such a person have been associated with William Neal? The answer is work. If a middling planter such as Neal hoped to raise his station in life and become more prosperous, he had to grow more tobacco. This type of farming requires a great deal of physical labor. Neal would have needed help, and he would have most likely bought, not hired, that help in the form of an indentured servant. Indeed, historical documents note that Neal, his wife, 2 children, and 2 unnamed indentured servants had lived at Leavenworth. During most of the 17th century, indentured servants were the colonial Chesapeake's main workforce. An indentured servant signed a legal document called an indenture, agreeing to work for a landowner for a term of 4 to 7 years. The landowner, also called the master, paid the servant's passage from England to the colony and provided food and a place for the servant to sleep. In exchange, the servant essentially belonged to the master for the entire term. For example, if it suited the master, he could sell a servant's indenture to another landowner. Of the thousands of people who came to the Maryland and Virginia colonies in the 17th century, 70 to 85% either came as indentured servants or signed indentured papers shortly after their arrival. Most were between the ages of 15 and 29, although some were younger. Younger children had to serve a longer period of time, sometimes as much as 12 years before they were freed. Upon completion of an indenture, masters had to give servants their freedom dues: an axe, 2 farm tools, a hoe for example, 3 barrels of corn, and a new suit of clothes. The government also gave servants the right to acquire 50 acres, or 20 hectares, of their own land. As Luckenbach explained, these servants did everything that slaves did later, when slavery became more widespread. The 17th century was a hard time, even if you were not an indentured servant, but it was particularly bad for indentured servants. They hauled water, butchered hogs and cattle, and hoed tobacco. They hung heavy bundles of tobacco in drying sheds and moved hogsheds, large casks that, when filled with dried tobacco leaves, weighed about 400 pounds, or 180 kilograms each. They erected fences and helped build shelters, some for drying tobacco and some for use as homes. In short, indentured servants did any job the master demanded, and if they died before their term of service ended, their remains met with whatever fate their masters chose. At times, masters treated their dead servants like a waste product, said Luckenbach. In fact, in 1661, Virginia enacted a law that prohibited the inappropriate burial of servants. Similar laws were considered in Maryland. The only reason such laws would have been discussed would be in response to an existing problem. To help evaluate his theory about the origins of the skeleton in Neal's cellar, Luckenbach asked Doug Osley to examine the bones. Using his standard procedures, Osley determined that they belonged to a male who had died when he was about 15 to 16 years old. The shape of the boy's skull was similar to the skulls of other 17th century English colonists. Measurement of the leg bones revealed that he had been 5 feet 2 inches tall, or 1.6 meters. He wasn't fully grown when he died, though. His arm and leg bone epiphyses were not yet fused. Next, Oasley searched for clues that might confirm or disprove Luckenbach's suspicion that the boy was a servant. If he had been a servant, he had lived a very different life from most modern American teens. He would have worked at hard labor from before dawn until after dark. Indeed, according to Oasley, the boy's bones told a story of a short, hard life. Although he was a boy, he did a man's worth of work. The muscle attachment areas of the boy's shoulder bones and humeri were sharply defined, proof that he'd done serious physical labor on a daily basis. He had carried heavy objects, perhaps buckets of water or heavy bundles of tobacco. He probably chopped logs for firewood and used a hoe. Perhaps he had moved hogsheads of tobacco. At some point, he had cracked his right elbow against something hard enough to fracture it. The break had healed before his death. Many of the vertebrae in the boy's lower back had shallow concave features called Schmurl's depressions. Schmurl's depressions are caused when the spine is compressed by some sort of trauma. For example, lifting heavy objects or twisting the back. Schmurl's depressions are often seen in modern weightlifters and gymnasts. At the very least, the teenager Neil Seller had, at times, a sore back. This bone evidence led Oasley to agree with Luckenbach's theory that the boy was an indentured servant. Indentured servants were often robust. They worked endlessly, he observed. There were few beasts of burden in the Chesapeake at that time. Wagons with wheels were rare too. When an indentured servant moved or hauled something, it was carried on his or her back. The teenager's bones showed it. As Luckenbach had observed, the circumstances of the burial pointed toward indentured servitude too. If servants die, you have to bury them. Burial cost the master money, said Oasley. A secret basement burial would have spared Neil the expense of a public one. It might also have saved him another kind of trouble. Some masters abused their indentured servants, either by mistreating them or by working them to death. A public burial might have given government officials the opportunity to inspect the remains, a situation an abusive master would want to avoid. Had the boy in Neil's basement been mistreated? Only further examination in the laboratory will reveal if abuse might have been a factor that led to a secret basement burial. Suspicious causes. Close study of the boy's skeleton in the Smithsonian Institute showed that his health and general well-being had been neglected for some time. His right humerus had a heel fracture near the elbow. A rib and 2 leg bones had formations of abnormal bone, and some of the boy's vertebrae exhibited an unusual amount of bone destruction. Oasley has seen these conditions in the bones of people who were known to have suffered from tuberculosis, a disease that infects the lungs and sometimes the skeleton. Tuberculosis often enters the spine. The Levy neck boy's bones may reflect the early signs of tuberculosis. The boy's teeth were in atrocious condition as well. Of the 30 teeth that were present, 19 had cavities, 3 large enough to have completely destroyed the crown. 5 teeth in the upper jaw and 2 in the lower had been badly infected. To have left signs in the jawbone, these pus-filled infections must have been ongoing for many weeks, probably months. The teeth, even more than his other ailments, must have caused the young man a great deal of pain. In fact, the infections that resulted from the terrible abscesses around the boy's teeth probably spread throughout the boy's body and poisoned his blood. Given the presence of these infections and the possibility of tuberculosis, it seems likely that the boy would have been in a weakened state. He probably found accomplishing a full day's work, something an indentured servant would have been expected to do, difficult, if not impossible. And that, Oasley theorized, may have been a factor that led to the boy's death. In the laboratory, examination of the skeleton continued. As the laboratory examination of the skeleton continued, Oasley and Carol Brulhide noticed 2 fractured bones in the right arm. One fracture was in one of several hand bones called the metacarpals. The break was in the area of the bone close to the boy's wrist. The other fracture was in the radius, the thick of a person's 2 lower arm bones. The fracture in the radius was at the end closest to the wrist and directly lined up with the fracture in the metacarpal bone. Because of this alignment in the 2 fractures, Oasley knew that they had occurred at the same time. Neither fracture showed any signs of healing, an indication that they occurred near or at the time of death. This type of fracture is consistent with breaks that occur as a result of a blow with a blunt object. A thick stick, for example. Might someone have been angry that the boy wasn't doing a full day's work and hit him to make him work harder? Oakley suspects that the boy was mistreated in this way. Somehow, someone got carried away and an altercation got out of hand. He speculates that the boy died as a result. Another look at the circumstances of the boy's burial supports this theory. Oakley examined the sherds of the large milk pan under a low level of magnification. He found that the broken edges of the similar pieces of the milk pan were sharp and jagged, the way a piece of broken ceramic normally appears. The edges of the large sherd, the one that was believed to have been used to cram the boy's body into the grave, were rounded, as if they had been polished smoother. "I'm absolutely certain that this large sherd was used as a digging tool," Oakley stated. Someone grabbed the sherd with both hands and used the broken edge to dig the pit to hide the body. He or she dug through the trash and then into the floor and part of the cellar wall. The formerly sharp edges of the sherd became rounded with the scraping. There is no other reason for this kind of shaping. The act of grabbing whatever means were at hand to dig the grave, rather than taking the time to get and use a proper tool, indicates that the person or people who buried the boy's body did so in haste and secrecy. The clandestine circumstances of the burial further support this scenario. Had the boy died merely as a result of a farm accident, there would have been no reason to hide his death or his burial, other than to avoid burial costs. Together, the forensic clues had led Oakley to believe that the boy died of suspicious causes. The Levy Neck boy's carbon-13 isotope value was negative 19.39, indicating that he hadn't lived in America for a long time before he died. Many of his health problems may have originated in England. If so, his life there must have been difficult as well. On his long journey to the colonies, had the boy dreamed of opportunity? Maybe of someday owning his own land? Life as an indentured servant would have been filled with days of endless work and demanding chores, leaving little time for dreams. The boy's early death ended them completely.